And so at this point, I'd like to introduce Craig Calhoun. Professor Calhoun has been already slightly introduced so that everyone knows that he has a USC connection. He also, of course, has a connection as the incoming director of the London School of Economics, and he knows Great Britain well. He has degrees from Oxford. He has been a moving force in the social sciences for many years. He's been the director of the Social Science Research Council for, over a decade, I think, like 98, 99, something around there. And so Craig has done workshops at USC and many, many other universities to help universities get the best possible out of research grant funding and bringing new ideas and all of the things that are so, really important about about SSRC and trying to galvanize the best research possible out of universities. He has a long and illustrious career in academia. He was at Chapel Hill. He also has a professorship at NYU. He's written many books, but his most recent focus on cosmopolitanism, I think, really endeared him to the LSE students when they came to this program, and we were talking about the fact that, the new director had just been announced, and I read off the names of some of your books, and when I got to cosmopolitanism, they all went, "Oh, that's why he got the job." Because it is a favorite topic of the students from the LSE who come to USC. And so we all believe that the students in this program are perfect markers of what it is to be cosmopolitanism in the best sense of the term. And so we're really thrilled that Craig could come. I was elated when he accepted this. And I saw him give the keynote at the International Communication Association conference last year, where I learned that he was a number of things that keynote speakers are often afraid to be. So when Stuart, in the earlier panel, which by the way was brilliant, I loved that panel. These sorts of panels, they can go either way, but this one was absolutely over the top. And so we were quite thrilled. When Stuart said that you needed courage, one of the things that Craig has is a lot of courage, because he pushed the academy. He pushed our association in terms of things that we could be doing better, things that we needed to work harder on, as well as magnifying those things that are already going well and the way in which we need to transition into a different kind of future for the field of communication. And so I'm sure that tonight's presentation will be equally both intriguing and thought-provoking, and it will, in the words of our graduation speaker, give us all pause. And so at that point, Craig, thank you for being here.
Well, I thought for a moment there, Patty was going to say, so Craig will be really pushy tonight. And I might. This may be a warning to my new LSE colleagues who are here, who will go back and repeat some of that the new director is inclined to not only congratulate people on the wonderful things they're already doing, but suggest that there's more to do. And my message will be a bit on that line tonight. But let me begin simply by thanking Patty. And in fact, there are a lot of people to thank, and I won't thank all, because it would require thanking everyone who's here and a few people who aren't. But let me thank particularly also Ernie Wilson and Larry Gross at USC, and Terry Rasmussen, and other colleagues who have come from the LSE, and in fact are still coming in. Sonia Livingston, I think, is just arriving tomorrow morning or late tonight, and so forth. People have traveled a long way for this, and that includes students from all over the world. It is, for me, one of the really cool honors about becoming director of the LSE. There have been a lot of honors and privileges that come with that, but being linked to this partnership is high on the list, and getting to join all of the graduates in celebrating their graduation is a key part of that. It's also fitting that at the end of this conference we will honor two of the great intellectuals associated with this program, USC's Manuel Castells, an old friend of mine, and LSE's Tony Giddens, an old friend and one of my predecessors, by creating scholarships to honor talented students in this program in the future, and I think to honor both Manuel and Tony, who have been leaders in thinking about global issues, including, but not only communications, but thinking about the very issue of how to think globally in this world with all the challenges it involves. And I'm delighted to speak after this afternoon's excellent opening panel, for which thanks to all who are a part of it. The theme was, what is a global university? And I'm going to say we heard part of the story, and I'm going to fill in a little bit of the rest, but a lot of it is actually in the future. So I think a really important thing to say out of this is we don't know, and we academics should admit more often when we don't know things. And the shape of what it is to be a global university is really very much a work in progress. Stuart Corbridge said during the panel that it's work that will be shaped in China, in India, in other parts of the world, but I think that it will be shaped and reshaped here. I think that the global university isn't going to be a simple globalization of a model that was established in Europe, in Scotland and England, in the United States, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Already that model's been transformed here. A problematic way of thinking about globalization generally that came to the forefront as we began to look at the latest wave of intensive globalization, the 80s and 90s and so forth, was to imagine that globalization meant simply the spreading of some pattern of doing things everywhere so that people would do things the same way all over. I think that it's clear by now that globalization doesn't mean that. The intensification of connections between different parts of the world involves a re-regionalization of the world in various ways, redefinitions of how institutions function in core countries, in metropoles, and in other parts of the world. Globalization is going to mean a shift in the balance of power, economically, politically, and otherwise, among countries in the world. It's going to mean rethinking what the institutions of knowledge are, both the old, long-established ones, which in fact have been rethought before, and new ones around the world. So we're likely to see a lot of change, and you're likely to make your careers in the midst of institutions that are changing dramatically. And that's mostly a good thing, but it would be unreasonable to pretend that it's all a good thing, because it is also partly a fraught, challenging, difficult world to figure out what's going on. You have skills and knowledge to do this, but you won't be able to figure it all out. You will have to make career decisions when you don't know which is the better thing to do, and you don't know how it will play out. And you have to just use your gut feeling, your best sense of the right direction to go. Because we're not going to see an era of change come to the end next year or the year after. For the last several years, since the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, people have been talking about recovery as though there would come a moment when everything would go back to normal. Now, first off, I'm not sure it was normal in 2008 or 2007, but secondly, I don't think there's any going back to some previous normal. So what we're embarked on is the making of new and different ways to do things in the world. And that's great. That's open, right? That is a source of an empowerment to create different institutions, but it's also challenging. So let me pick up a couple of themes about this question of global universities, but then link that to other things about globalization, about the global predicament today. We shouldn't have a discussion about universities or about global communication or about global careers that doesn't consider the fact that the world is a mess, that the world is undergoing enormous upheavals. Right? Just look at what seemed to be that very promising, idealistic project, the European Union. the Eurozone, right? But look at the last couple of years of news from the Middle East. Look at the shift in relations, not just China and U.S. debt, but China's own slowdown, issues within China, political upheavals that are going on in China, China's fraught relations with its neighbors in Asia. Look at every part of the world, and you will see a world that is undergoing big changes that are the occasions for political contest and social movements, and that involve open questions about what's going to happen. So there's no such thing as a field of global communication that isn't intimately involved with all of these big changes in the world. And there's no such thing as a global university that isn't intimately involved with all these changes and issues in the world. A global university, I'm going to suggest, works globally. I'll say a little bit about that, building on some of the things from the panel. And it addresses the most pressing global issues, because it doesn't matter whether you have the NYU model of campuses in other countries or the LSE USC model of partnerships, if you don't actually go to work on the most pressing global issues. It's not just a question of what sort of structural relationships an institution is going to have. It's a question of what we do. Right? Do we tackle the big questions? Do we have new things to say about property rights and freedom of information, or about environment and other issues in the world? And a global university prepares students for careers meeting global challenges. Now note that I didn't just say global careers. I hope that we do that too. That is, I hope that we prepare our students, including all of the recent graduates here, for successful global careers, making more money, doing the jobs you want to do, being gainfully employed, and having all of this take place in the most lovely of cosmopolitan cities with fine restaurants and waterfronts. Right? But the reason we do this is a bit more than that. The reason we do this is so you will do work that matters, work that changes the world, work that is really important. So yes, I hope you get paid a lot for that work, but I also hope that you are determined to do that work, that you're in this for the issues you're going to tackle, for the good you're going to do, whether you are working in business or you are working in government or you're working in academia, right? In whatever sector, in whatever kind of position, there are opportunities to be making the world a better place for all of us. And we need this. In fact, now that I'm getting to be sort of white-haired and old, boy, do we need you young people to do something better than we did before. So it's no accident that a field of Masters in Global Communication, a cooperation in this area, would do these things, would work globally, would tackle global problems, would prepare students to meet global challenges. Few fields more intrinsically address global concerns than media and communication. Yet, as soon as I say that, we should be reminded that communications scholarship, like the legacy media themselves, have not always been as fast to rise to the challenges of globalization as they might be. I know that Larry doesn't want me to say this, but I think we have two major communications associations, one of which is a little more global than the other in this country. And in this country, right, we still have largely national structures of scholarship. We make a serious effort to try to be more international, to bring international voices to the ICA or into various kinds of journal issues and other forums for communication. But it's not the case that scholarship is organized overwhelmingly in a global flow of knowledge. On the contrary, it's still very heavily national, with some efforts to globalize and some successes in that. And we're getting better. Moreover, communications is a field that spans every scale from the immediately interpersonal to the worldwide. And that's leaving out theories that would take communications down to the level of cells and neurons, which have more than a few adherents. It's a field where we can see both the centrality and the complexity of globalization and the extent to which action and our loyalties are at many levels at once. Patty nicely said, and evidently students nicely remarked on my writing about cosmopolitanism, but my writing about cosmopolitanism, among other things, has said that it's easy to be too self-congratulatory about how cosmopolitan we are and to imagine that that's enough. Don't worry, I've got an Italian suit, right? My watch is German, right? I've got all of these various cosmopolitan tastes and enough money to, at least in sort of small-scale ways, actualize them, right? It's easy to be complacent, self-congratulatory, to think that we are moving out of narrow and parochial local cultures, right? We're leaving behind those people who stayed stuck in the places we came from. But we forget sometimes that we're moving into a culture. We're not moving into the absence of culture. We're not becoming universal, right? We're absorbing a global culture with global tastes and global knowledge. This is something that I think requires reflection. I don't mean that it's not good to be cosmopolitan. I think it's very good. But I think it carries an obligation to be somewhat self-critical and to think about the social foundations. Right? What passport do you carry, and how often do you get stopped when you try to go through an airport? Right? What credit cards do you have, and have you paid them off recently when you go to make purchases internationally? Okay? Cosmopolitanism has material foundations. It privileges people from some countries. It privileges people who speak English. Now that may change, right? But right now, it's an advantage to native English speakers. It's an advantage to people who've had the kinds of educations that enabled them to be at home in English, who will be able to have international careers that people who aren't at ease in English won't have. So you are all beneficiaries of this, but we should recognize that not everyone is. And so it's very important to try to be cosmopolitan, but it's important to think of that as not quite so simple as just being a citizen of the world with no other involvements, no other citizenship, no questions about material foundations in various ways. Take, for example, this global program. It is also an alliance of cities, as was briefly mentioned earlier. Yes, it's about the globals and looking globally at issues of communication, but it's also shaped by being a link between London and Los Angeles. And each of these cities is global in distinctive ways. And that's part of the substance of the program. That's part of what it engages. And it's part of what we understand about a whole range of world cities. The world is not just global in being the same way all at once, nor is it divided only into nations. It's divided into religions, into social movements, into languages, into cities, into a host of different sorts of networks which we inhabit and which connect us in various ways. And these are all important. So part of what we engage when we write research or whether we work in multinational corporations in other ways are these many different overlapping ways of being global and inhabiting global connections. And we need to pay attention and recognize all of them. And they're all shaped by globalization. Now, of course, this is not simply a story of problems, not simply a story of good things. It's not an altogether happy story to be self-congratulatory about. I would take this program to be something that we should celebrate, rather more, for example, than we celebrate the News Corporation. But we shouldn't ever just be uncritically celebratory. So what is it that universities do when we say they work globally? Please, just a little bit of that theme from the earlier discussion. There are flows of students that are part of this, obviously. So we've heard about the percentages of students who come from foreign countries to different universities, to the LSE or USC, for example. But actually, part of globalization is that London and Los Angeles are global without simply the foreigners who come, because there are so many other people already there from so many different sources. People who are British citizens and American citizens bring global backgrounds to their studies. These are already global phenomena, then further enhanced by international participation in various ways. Universities in the United States pioneered a form of study abroad, the junior year abroad, and similar sorts of functions that was presumed to be about giving Americans who looked like me and had accents like me, some exposure to foreign places in some ways, initially principally in Europe. Right? But international study has way exceeded this model, and it's changing all over the place as people go to multiple institutions for their degrees, as you are doing with LSE and USC, but for many people, making their own programs, transferring in the course of their degrees, attending 2 or 3 institutions to get a degree, moving around the world, going to work for an NGO for 2 years in between their bachelor's and their master's degrees, finding a variety of different ways to weave global knowledge into their studies as they move. And the idea of study abroad is changing. It's changed with internships becoming more and more important. It's changed in a way with research that students undertake, not just studies in language or culture in other places and so forth. And there is a need for all these to be fully global. One of the illusions of cosmopolitanism is if we imagine that because we know a lot of people from some other places, we know every place. And we don't, right? Even within particular countries. I've traveled, I think, 7 or 8 times to India, sometimes for as long as several weeks. And yet, I've only been in, by my best count, 5 different Indian provinces, right? A minority of the country. It's a huge, diverse country. I think I know something about India from visiting it, but I certainly don't know India in any strong sense. And we could go on and on and on with these kinds of examples. And when we have international programs, but they're based on costs that make it possible for only some people to attend from some backgrounds or some parts of the world, then that means that we narrow who we meet and what we know. As broadening as this is, as much as it opens up new contacts, it's not everyone and everywhere, and we need to be attentive to that. We need to try to work on it. It's good that we have scholarship programs. There are flows of faculty in the universities, and they're like your careers. More and more people are making international careers of various ways. They're working in universities in different parts of the world, but they're also working in other lines of work in different parts of the world. That's simply becoming a part. We need to recognize this. We need to see how important it is to global higher education. We need to recognize also, though, that it is a matter of global class formation. It's a matter of a reorganization of structures of professional life on a global scale that were often organized in very unequal ways inside countries and are now organized with global dimensions, but unequal ones. Right? This is very different from the migrations that produce populations of taxi drivers in Toronto or New York, or produce populations of unskilled laborers in various parts of the world. There are multiple migrations going on, of which this professional elite formation is only a part. There are research connections that university faculty make around the world, and increasingly students make, that have been talked about in all this, joint programs and partnerships. And we had this extended discussion of universities with multiple sites, like the one where I've taught, and I have actually taught at NYU in Abu Dhabi, as well as in New York, and been a part of that venture, but also the range of other ways in which universities are working globally. Let me just ask us for a moment to remember that universities are corporations of a kind, they're companies of a kind, they're organizations, and they're in a field in which lots of other organizations are finding lots of different ways to work globally. So we're not really completely different from that. There's global work that is done in mediated terms entirely. There's global work where the mediation is part of a story that also involves face-to-face contact. There's global work that involves various kinds of hybrid programs. In fact, one of the fastest growing kinds, and some of the successes we have at the LSE and with partners, are in programs that are structured to take place in 3 or 4 cities over a period of 2 years. So that the program actually has multiple sites, none of which necessarily involves a full-fledged campus of a university, but an integration into the city in various ways. And this can be for business or it can be for urban studies. There are various different ways to do that. My point here is that one of the things that I think is happening to global knowledge is that the traditional institutions are changing, and they're changing in ways that change the relationships between universities and other kinds of organizations like business firms and so forth. And we see different structures emerging with all of them. One of the big questions is, what is it that makes the model of the university a package to be reproduced or not reproduced, right? Why do we say, oh, well, it should have these things in it, right? A university is necessarily made up of a faculty of sciences, of social sciences, of arts and humanities. There are various professional schools. It might own a hospital and a radio station. Here's a model of the university to either be exported or not. Well, this is not a universal model of the university. Even between our two universities, we don't exemplify a common model, right? The LSE, Stuart called it a boutique university, is a university centered on the social sciences. It has Britain's top-ranked law school. It has other professional programs. It's not limited in a narrow sense to social science. And what goes on in the teaching of law is shaped by the fact that law is not an entirely separate school, but is part of an integrated social science university. But it's a social science university. It doesn't have a medical school. It doesn't have an engineering school. Now, there are things that we lose out on, or we have to form other partnerships with neighboring universities to benefit from some of those things. So as there's more and more neuroscience research in fields like economics, then we build connections to neighboring universities that have the laboratories to do that. But my point is just that there are different definitions. We shouldn't imagine there's a single model, and there are different definitions in China and in India and in other places, and they're going to grow up. What we need to do is ask, what is it we think is really important to have brought together in the same place? What is crucial to this experience that we think is so important? And I do think it's so important about sharing in face-to-face environments this common inquiry and this educational process. Well, all of this intersects with other changes in higher education, with issues of cost that were talked about. And I'll stick in the note that while American universities are pleased to say that they are need-blind at admissions, as Stuart said, and there are some that actually achieve this pretty closely for their American students, there is not one that is need-blind in its admission of international students. Not even Princeton, which is probably the wealthiest of these and the closest to it. And many, right, depend very significantly on fees from international students who don't receive scholarships at anywhere near the same rate that American students do. So the University of Washington, a state university, has an explicit policy of trying to considerably increase the proportion of international students because they will pay full tuition at the highest possible rate for courses which it's obliged to offer at a discounted rate to in-state residents in Washington. Does this sound familiar to the LSE? We do the same thing there, right? This is something that is part of looking critically at the structures of our cosmopolitan relations. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be universal. It would be open as we can be for universities to be as global as they can be, but it means we need to look at that and ask critical questions. And then what is the answer, right? So do we say, oh, well, that's very bad, but I don't want to be taking money from donors because, you know, there are a bunch of rich capitalists who have other agendas, or some of them are, you know, dictators in Arab countries, that we have to worry about, right, mixing in this world of money because our ethical standards will be challenged. I think it's true. We need to really work hard to keep high ethical standards, but we need to ask ourselves if we want scholarship funds so that international students are not always seen as a revenue source in relation to domestic students, we'd better ask where that money is going to come from. And we have to put these things together, and it's not easy. Right? It would be easier if we could say, right, lots of scholarships, no need to worry about donors, right? But it isn't that world. It is a world in which some of you will become wealthy, and we need you as donors. There is no option for universities to not work in a world in which money matters. There's no option these days for universities in the United States or Britain to work in a world in which governments are going to pay all the bills. And mind you, when governments pay all the bills, it's not as though they don't raise the occasional ethical concern with what they do as well. Okay? We have to tackle these complexities in order to be cosmopolitan. There are a host of other issues, and I won't go into all of them. The whole issues of the new technologies, the rise of professional fields. Something that's very important in communication is an ambiguity about the relationship between a field of academic study and a field of professional practice. Right? It's something that I think is all in all a source of creativity and a benefit. I like that about communications. I think these mutually inform each other in good ways, but it's something to work on and to keep alive. It doesn't just fit a standard package. We would not be exporting the best model of communications research if we tried to export a model of the university that said there is a complete division between those arts and science faculties in the liberal arts and professional schools, right? We have to overcome that binary opposition to have a better model to be able to spread and circulate in the world. The issue of the relations between, or the elitism of this, is an important issue. It was raised in the earlier panel, right? To what extent are we talking about an elite part of a system? Right? And I want to suggest one feature of that is what is the relationship between the elite and the rest of the system? So we can approach this question of the inequality within universities in various ways. We can say, well, inequality is a bad thing. We would rather more equality. But we have a very, very large system. And then how is it going to be differentiated? What does it do? But we also have questions about what is the meaning of this in terms of relationships? For example, in the United States, in California, the old master plan for the University of California and the related public institutions in California suggested not every institution would offer PhD degrees, that there would be a division of labor of different kinds of institutions doing different things. Around the world, this has proved hard to sustain. Britain had something like this division of labor and more or less gave it up in the creation of a large number of new universities, and then now faces financial crises and retrenchments and changes in that. The United States saw an enormous number of universities. When I was the dean at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, one of my, what's the opposite of favorite? What's the memory that you have all the time that is not your favorite? Was when I studied history, and history is not a field known for its booming job markets anytime recently. I'd just like to mention, if you ever have any questions about communications, you could have been studying history. But in the early 1990s, right, when there were no jobs for historians, when historians were driving taxi cabs, the University of North Carolina at Charlotte brought a proposal to create a new PhD program in history. The state of North Carolina already had multiple PhD programs in history at Chapel Hill, at Duke, at various places. And the question was raised, why did the University of North Carolina at Charlotte need a new PhD program? The answer was, well, our faculty are just as entitled to have PhD students as the faculty at those other places. That's not a very good reason, actually. It's a reason that is being raised around the world. The SSRC, where I'm still president, has launched a new set of scholarship programs for PhD students in Africa and confronted the fact that there are a relatively small number of universities with good PhD programs. And then there are a whole variety of other universities that have just announced that they are also entitled to offer PhDs. And so one of the problems for PhD programs in a variety of countries is the difficulty of arriving at an agreement, of saying, say, that Makerere will give PhD degrees and not every other university in Ghana, and not every institution of higher learning will be called a university, or in Uganda in that case, and so forth and so on, right? The same thing is coming up in China. The same thing is coming up in a whole range of other settings. That one of our issues is being able to distinguish the different types of institutions and what they might do, and it has a big effect on everything. Well, the issue of rankings and hierarchy does that too. I think that I agree with Stuart that in many ways the assessment of research has been beneficial. But one thing I want to always insist on is that the goal isn't to be highly ranked, that's an indicator. right? The goal is to do something important and distinctive that really matters, and then to do it really well, and you hope that being highly ranked follows. But we have a sort of confusion, and it's not just at the LSE or at USC, each of which is already highly ranked and aspires to be even higher ranked. It's around the world where policy is being made on the basis of we are number 486 and our goal is to be in the top 400, right? And that's the goal, and that's setting the purpose. Not the goal is to expand the availability of knowledge. The goal is to solve human problems. The goal is to provide educated professionals for the society in which we live. No, the goal is the ranking, and that's a problem when that happens. And that's an issue of inequality around the world. And it's an issue that's not unique to universities because it's part of the fact that this globalization of higher education and a lot of the rest of globalization has come in an era of hugely expanded inequality and a tendency to compete over positions in the hierarchy as ends in themselves, not just as indicators of something else. And that's a challenge for us. Well, in all of this, there's a short answer, easier said than done, which is that the key issue is to remain clear about our core academic mission. But that's really a subject of debate. What are we here for? Right? What's our purpose? I've suggested it's not just more money. It's really doing things. So how do we address the most pressing global issues? Right? Well, there are a whole bunch of things here, and there's not a lot of time. So let me be really brief in this. But it's a substantive question, and it comes up in every line of study. It would come up if we were doing physical science. How does that relate to environmental issues in the world? How does it relate to natural resource issues? It comes up in communication. It comes up everywhere. And it comes up both in the context of what are the big issues? So environment, as I've said, resources, development, urbanization, war, and human conflict. We live in a world which is still fraught with war. We used to think that progress was just going to do away with that, but it doesn't seem to. Financial stabilization and crises, right? Various issues of social welfare. There are lots and lots of these issues, some of them bigger than others, right? And the challenge is to learn how to work on them. Well, working on them, right, turns out to be an interesting question for universities. Notice that the list of issues does not correspond to a list of disciplines. Right? The disciplines that we have are organized in different terms, right, as fields of study: political science, sociology, economics, so forth and so on. Right? How we get people with different disciplinary knowledge and skills to work together on these big issues is a challenge. One bit of that challenge is getting people to work in groups. We have educational systems that are overwhelmingly organized to give rewards for individual achievement. We have problems in the world that cannot be solved by individuals. We have corporations and governments that know that people need to work in groups, and that we need to be able to bring together interdisciplinary groups of people with different skills to be able to tackle these problems. Right? The environmental problem, it's partly atmospheric science, it's partly economics, it's partly culture. Right? We need people with different backgrounds working together. You are all trained partly to do this and facilitate this as work, and it's crucial work that requires both the knowledge of the different fields, the willingness to learn anew in the collaborative work, and the willingness and ability to work in a team. And working in a team is not just a matter of personality. It's a skill. It's something you learn, and you only learn it by doing it. And we need more people in the world who are willing and able and skilled to work in teams in this way. It's a crucial thing. We need to ask about the relationship between practical fields and academic study, as I said before. Right? And communications is a prime example, but engineering and game theory, or anthropology and design, there are dozens and dozens of these examples where there are exciting lines of work that potentially bring people together across the boundaries of practical action, professional skills, and academic learning. This can reorganize the way we teach, the relationship between research and teaching, but we have to admit most of the time it doesn't, because most of the time we're busy and we repeat what we did last year. I hope this program is an exception to that we repeat only the good things we did last year, and we keep innovating. So, excuse me, I've been coughing and sneezing since I got off the airplane. I am evidently allergic to Los Angeles. I used to live here and I wasn't allergic then, but in any case. Right. All of these things, right, where we come together in different groups, these are first and foremost working groups. They may be 5 people, they may be 30, but the nature of working groups has changed in globalization. A simple example is to look at colleagues in the biotech fields, related fields of medicine, where you'll see articles with 40 and 50 and 60 co-authors, because it would be impossible to produce the research just with one person in one lab. It was alluded to today that people have international links, but it's not just international. These will be people in 5 different countries, but they're also, right, people who have learned to work in a different way that is not trapped by a 19th century theory of genius and individual achievement and is about getting the job done collectively and working together, and actually enables people to fulfill their individual desires more. This is actually, there's a wonderful piece of research that shows on scientists. Scientists were surveyed who work in private laboratories and work in university laboratories, and the ones in private laboratories were happier in this research with their jobs, and they were asked why, and the investigation turns out that the reason is the ones in the private laboratories actually share more with each other and have stronger relationships with their colleagues, which sort of outraged and offended everybody in the academic settings until they stopped and thinking, well, every time I'm evaluated, am I the sole author of this article? Am I the first author of this article? Did I have priority in the research? Not did I do something collectively that maybe made money for the whole company together with this. Well, we have a whole host of things going on in the world that need our collective attention. I've talked about them topically. We could go through it. I'm not going to take the time to do it regionally in the world, right? But just when you say Europe right now, there needs to be a big exclamation mark afterwards, and that's a big clue, right? But it goes on over and over in every other region in the world, a kind of shifting of tectonic plates, sort of rethinking of the institutions. You are brilliantly placed to be working within this, reporting on this, exploring this, shaping this. As there is a shaping, it won't be just globalization at large. It will be remaking Europe. It will be remaking Asia. Right? There's all kinds of new relations in Asia, right? Direct investment between China and India that's reshaping each country and the relations between them, and so forth and so on. Africa sounded like a sort of sad story earlier, but I would point out it's not China that has the world's fastest growth right now, it's several African countries. Africa is a major story of economic growth right now, growth that's led in part by communications industries. Right? This is a part of the world that we're looking at, and we need to keep focusing on it. You know, the Arab world, I think there's been sort of a communications-related story there recently. So we've talked about global university, we've talked about all this. I want to close by saying a couple of things that I think it will take to succeed in global careers. Already takes, and it will take more and more. I've mentioned the teamwork. I think it's going to take an ability to work in groups, but it's going to take an ability to work in shifting groups, in networks that arrange and rearrange over time. And in that context, it's going to take an ability to discern context itself and how it matters, to figure out the context you're in. A communications-related skill, but not just to communicate, not about the sender of the messages, but about the assessment of the context, the communicative context they're in, and what works in one setting after another as you move around internationally or organizationally in this. Knowledge of specific context, but also knowledge of a kind of skill. And let me make a quick sort of total tangent of an anecdote to illustrate this. The US military is not known for its cultural sensitivity. So it was a welcome thing when a new Secretary of Defense a few years ago said that he wanted to try to improve that. The way in which the Defense Department initially set out to do this was to try to teach all the soldiers a little bit about the cultures into which they would be deployed, and then hire experts who knew more about it. every soldier sent to Iraq was issued a little card of essential learnings about Iraq. A card about the size of a playing card, or about a 5x7 card, actually, on both sides. It contained the essential knowledge of Iraq. As you can imagine, you can't fit very much essential knowledge on a 5x7 card. And that's the point. There's a limit to what just knowing about other cultures can do, because there are a lot of other cultures. You can't know about all of them. You can't know about enough of them. It's good to know more. What's really key is learning how to learn about other cultures when you're interacting with them. Right? What was missed in that program is it's not knowing 5 sentences in Arabic, or whether it's a good idea to show the soles of your shoes to people in a particular culture. Those are useful things, but what's crucial is the ability to pick those things up. It's learning to learn that is so crucial. And actually, a group of people in the Defense Department, quite bizarrely, I found out about them literally. I was sitting in my study trying to write when I received a phone call from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. I was asked, it was Professor Calhoun, I think asked, and they said, well, we've been reading Pierre Bourdieu. And this led us to call you. I thought this was suspicious, but what was the real point, right? I said, we are interested in whether there is a habitus, a sort of habituated way in which people deal with people from other cultures. We wonder if maybe our training programs were barking up the wrong tree in just trying to teach people about each other culture one at a time, whether what we should be doing, right, is shaping the way in which people deal with other cultures in general, the way in which they deal with difference. Well, that's, I think, part of what you have implicitly studied. I'm going to bet you never had that as a course topic, but what you had was each other, right? What you had was the LSE and USC and all of you, right? And as you go through your careers, you will have innumerable situations in which you will be able to improve this skill, right? And I repeat, skill. It's not an abstract knowledge. It's not what you know about the French or what you know about the Chinese or what you know about any other one culture. It's what you know about being open and learning. And I think the single most important thing in global knowledge is this capacity to learn and the knowledge that we need to keep doing it over and over again in all of our interactions if we are going to work together and solve these big problems. And I'm counting on you, as I said, doing a better job than all the people my age did. Thank you. And nothing's off limits.
So you talked about
thank you.
Teamwork. Sorry.
And all your friends thank you too.
Yeah. My name's Ev Boyle. I'm in the global media program. I just graduated. My voice is not enough. But you talked about this idea of working in teams, and especially the multidisciplinary, cross-cultural, cross-disciplines aspect of this. And you said that we learn it, and it's really important to learn that. I'm just wondering, outside of interacting with sort of different people and cultures, from the multidisciplinary perspective, within the universities, where do you see that happening, or how do you see it happening? Because I think still, at this point at least, almost all of the work you do is going to be within your department or your area.
So I think that's true, and I think it's also true that almost all the work you do will be individual work. And so on both counts, we're not doing as well as I think we need to. And that means that we need to find ways to build into master's degrees or other educational programs experience working in groups, solving problems, right? Doing creative work together. And that's a challenge. People don't like feeling their grades are going to be dependent on what somebody else does in a group, and there are a whole series of other problems with this. So I'm not saying that it's just easy, we can announce it tomorrow. But I think we need to do it because what people find on graduation in a whole host of different careers is that they will be expected to do this. You know, you go to work for Apple Computer and they don't say be an isolated individual. Go to work for Google, they don't say be an isolated individual. They create environments designed to get people to interact. They create matrix teams. They put teams in competition with each other. Okay, we're going to design a new device of some sort, and we're going to get 3 teams working on parts of this, and one of them is going to be the big winners. But they're going to work as teams because the device is going to take people working on different parts of the technology, right? I mean, crudely, software and hardware, but even just in hardware terms, there are just a bunch of different components to these things. And so they bring different skills. And the winning thing is going to be partly a matter of the design. Right? If it's Apple, that was going to loom larger. And some other companies, it's going to loom less large. But the little aesthetic design. It's going to be a matter of the user interface. And maybe there are going to be people who are anthropologists out doing some trials as they take prototypes out and watch how people use them and come back. And it's going to be a matter of processor speed. And there are going to be people working on that and on overheating because you get too much heat generated by the faster processors. Right? I mean, and these different skills are not going to be in 6 different rooms down a hallway. They're going to be people coming together around a practical task. So I think we have to get that. But then the same thing goes for the learning. Now, already in a seminar where you have people from different countries, you're starting on this, right? You're doing more of that and you're interacting. And one of the really good things about high interaction kinds of teaching, which I think we have in this program and in others, but where there really is an expectation that people speak up and talk to each other and that there's discussion in the classes, not merely lectures from teachers, is that it encourages some of this learning. But we can go much further and do better with that. And I think that these are crucial. Now, the other thing you raise is the issue of the department. And I think this is more of an issue in the more straight academic programs than it is in professional schools. I think in general, professional programs have been better about being interdisciplinary because they are more likely to look at things in terms of a problem to be solved from different kinds of inputs, a practice to be cultivated. But in every kind of institution, partly because the academics are researchers who have their own very specific lines of research, there's a tendency to narrow this down. And it's problematic. I think that interdisciplinary programs tend to do this better, and there are different constraints on having more interdisciplinary programs and different problems that arise with them. It's not that they're all better in all ways. They're better at this, right? So it's kind of a both-and question. How can we have some of the intellectual rigor, which tends to come from disciplinary departments, which are literally disciplining in that way, and combine that with some of the creativity and the interpersonal learning and the other things that come from interdisciplinary programs and tackling new problems. Disciplines tend to be defined in terms of subject matters rather than problems in a certain way. And problem-oriented work, trying to work together on figuring things out and coming up with solutions to problems often encourages much more interactive styles in a way. So that's my best starting point, but I'm hoping that lots of other people will be working on this, and I think it's going on in various universities and in different settings. Yeah.
I very much like the notion that global universities, elite universities, have this role to play, be entrepreneurial and innovative. But of course, everyone who lives in a university culture knows that universities are the most conservative of institutions, and that the challenges of setting up this program would clearly have illustrated how hidebound universities are in doing things the way they always do them. So now that you have this opportunity to actually be in charge, I'm just curious what you see as your own role as providing innovative leadership to move a faculty to create this kind of model that other universities will want to follow.
Well, first, this is absolutely right, this in charge thing. So not only are there some rumors that not everybody at the LSE does what the director says all the time. So different from here. So different. And I also understand that despite the fact that almost all the faculty are amazingly creative and innovative, there are a few who are a little bit conservative about some things. So this is not going to change overnight there either. I don't think this is something where the idea of the director leading is exactly the right idea. I think creating conditions of work in which people have things to work on that lead them to work in different ways is the issue. So I don't think I can go around and say, well, here's what we should do in finance, and here's what we should do in accounting, and here's what we should do in this. First off, I don't know. But even if I did, it's not the way it's going to happen. It's, I think, a question of generating discussion in which there is agreement to some goals, which then people can work on in different ways, and creating the conditions for them to work on them in different ways. Both USC and LSE, and in fact almost all universities, talk about being decentralized. How decentralized they are and in what ways is always a question. And I'm not going to probe the USC decentralization or lack of it. But I think that the same things I was saying about learning apply to faculty members trying to solve problems. That is there something for people to work on together that would have an outcome as opposed to just a measurement of what they're doing, right, that gets repeated. And I think that there are sometimes. So I think, and I'll give us a simple example and one that I think go too far. So this program was hard to set up. But a whole range of master's programs of varying levels of complexity, not always involving two universities, have sprung up. And they've sprung up partly because there is a need in the world for post-baccalaureate, mostly professional, but sort of hybrid training. And there are a lot of students who want to take these programs, who feel their undergraduate educations were great, but now they really know what they want to do and they need something more specific. But the real reason these sprang up is also that a whole variety of units in universities with decentralized financial management are going to say, this is a potential revenue stream, right? And they solved collective problems. They looked at this and said, well, what can we do if we put all of our teaching into PhD students? What can we do if we put some of it into master's students? How do we balance this? What does it do for the department? And when there was an invitation to think creatively and there was some flexibility about that, they innovated. And they came up with new programs, and sometimes wonderful new programs like this one. So I think it's partly a matter of changing the structure a little bit and the constraints a little bit and getting out of people's way a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you. The question I wanted to ask is something that's been alluded to, especially in the earlier panel, which is this idea about how we define an elite, and especially when we talk about things like global careers. Are we actually creating something that's quite cut off from the rest of society? And I wanted to think about that in the context of, so I guess one of the sort of paradoxes of globalization is that there's almost always a sort of opposite and equal reaction in terms of forces of reaction and reactionary politics. And in particular, whether there was a challenge for the idea of the globalized university in the sort of world of austerity and in the world where maybe there will be political movements that will very overtly reject the particular sort of manifestation of globalization we've had for the past 20, 25 years.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. I think that's insightful and it's absolutely right. So I'll rephrase it only in one small way, which is to say that this dialectic between globalization and resistance to globalization shouldn't be thought of as just the progressive and the reactionary, because what appears as reactionary sometimes is progressive other times. So if the globalization is the relentless onslaught of American-led consumer capitalism, some level of friction from various national cultures elsewhere might be, quote, progressive in relation to that, right? It depends on your values and it depends on what you think. So I think that we are wrong to assume that all versions of globalization represent simply the good, and that all versions of resistance represent simply the bad. Secondly, what we're calling resistance here is often quite proactively trying to do something else. It's not necessarily just a reaction. So with those two qualifiers, I still think the basic point is right. I think that globalization produces nationalism. So one of the illusions, for example, of much thinking of this is that somehow nationalism is seen as an old thing we always had, and then globalization as sort of a progressive movement away from that. But in fact, the intensification of nationalism is a response to globalization, whether it's good or bad or whatever else is going on. It's part of this world and a change in the conditions for people in various different cultures. Secondly, inside those cultures, there are questions about who's more associated with the global and who with the national and who with the very local. There are different elites who often are associated with different projects in a country. And so a tension may play out, which is partly about the way in which a country is going to adapt to its global circumstances. And it's not just a yes-no, right? But it's difficult because it is played out as competing elites who have different projects, say an Islamist project and a Western modernization project, or whatever they might be, neither of which is simply the voice of the people, right? They both are elites, but they have different ideas of what will work better under different versions. Things that we often see as reactive, I mentioned Islamism, for example, are actually transnational projects. That's globalization, right? Islam is globalization as much as Google is globalization. They're different models of globalization and need to be seen that way. So what do we do about this? I think we approach the various issues in issue-specific ways, trying to keep the focus as much as possible on the mix of practical consequences and not blanket terms like this is cosmopolitanizing or globalizing or good in that way, but trying to assess in more particular ways in the different issue arenas that come up, say in environmental concerns or something like that, where the big umbrella terms like globalization or resistance don't often get you to the concrete issues about, say, Lake Baikal and what's happening to Lake Baikal. Yeah. You had your hand up? Yeah?
Yeah, that's right. It's on the C word, cosmopolitanism. Not communication. You, in your very fantastic speech, you seem to give a lot of sophisticated and I think quite accurate reasons why one should rethink any easy assumptions about globalization and any idealism around it. Do you think the word cosmopolitanism is actually a hindrance now, or are you prepared to make some kind of idealistic case for it?
Really good question, to which I do not have a good answer, and I've worried about it a lot, so I know I don't have a good answer. Because I'm trying to finish, before I move to London, a book. It's a sort of race I may not finish. And in its draft, the book has the word cosmopolitan in the title, and it's a hindrance to finishing the book. That is, but not because there's no idealism, because I find it very hard to find a tone of writing that doesn't slide off one way into the sort of idealism of we are cosmopolitan, or the other way into a purely debunking mode. Oh, look, I can make so many jokes about people who think they are such sophisticated cosmopolitans. And I think that so I'm finding it hard, and I think it is hard in general. The word has been used so promiscuously and so uncritically that it's hard to reclaim it for what the ideals are. But it's still one of the best available words in English if we could shed that baggage for trying to talk simultaneously about enlargement of our perspective and attention to diversity and difference. Because it signals both in ordinary usage. And what's good about it and beguiling about it is that it signals not only sort of wider reach, right? The way universalism would signal it. If you replaced cosmopolitanism with universalism, it would signal wider reach. But then it would no longer signal the internal diversity. So if, and I haven't solved this problem for my writing, so I don't have an answer to give. I'm very tempted to say the answer is we should give this word a rest because it's been overused and find some other way to talk about it. What I would miss in that, to finish off, is part of what we mean when we say a city's cosmopolitan. And we aren't talking about a person and we aren't talking about the world, but we're talking about the way in which people behave and relate. And we say London's a cosmopolitan city. People from all over the world rub shoulders with each other, talk to each other. There are all sorts of ways in which somebody walking down the street experiences a cosmopolitan milieu. I think that's now drowned out by the more political, ethical meanings of it, but I'd be sorry to lose it.
I'm going to take this opportunity to ask everyone to give Craig a really big round of applause.
Thank you.